My name is Maggie Sullivan. I'm 64 years old, and until last spring I would have told you, without hesitation, that I had one of those steady, sensible marriages people like to point at and say, now that's how it's done. 38 years with the same man, the same house, the same routines, the kind of life that doesn't make headlines because it doesn't look like trouble. My husband, Bob, was an accountant. Numbers made him calm. Receipts, statements, tidy folders with labels written in that careful block handwriting of his, those were his comfort. If you asked him what love looked like, he might not have said roses or poetry. He would have said security. He would have said, I've got it handled. And for most of my life, I let that be enough. Every Tuesday, without fail, Bob went to the bank at exactly 2:09 p.m. Not around 2. Not after lunch. Exactly 2 by. I used to tease him about it. You know they'll survive if you show up at 2:15, I'd say, standing at the kitchen sink with my hands in suds, watching him straighten his tie in the hallway mirror like he was headed to a board meeting instead of a small-town branch bank. He'd smile, just a small lift at the corner of his mouth, and tap his watch. Discipline, he'd say, that's how you keep the future safe. Those words became a kind of slogan in our house. Keep the future safe. He said it when he paid off the car. He said it when he refused a vacation we couldn't justify. He said it when he moved money from one account to another while I sat beside him like a passenger watching the road go by. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't foolish. I raised 2 kids. I kept a home. I worked part-time when the children were young and full-time when they got older. But somewhere along the way, Bob became the keeper of the financial world, and I became someone who trusted. It's hard to explain to younger people how easy that arrangement felt in our generation. You're taught that a good man protects. You're told a good wife doesn't nag. You learn the quiet pride of being taken care of, the way you learn to fold fitted sheets even if you never truly master it. So Tuesday at 2:00 became as ordinary as grocery day, as harmless as a dentist appointment. It was just Bob being Bob, until the Tuesday that never came. Bob died on a Friday morning. It was quick, the doctor said. A heart attack. The kind that doesn't negotiate, doesn't give you time to get your shoes on and drive to the hospital, doesn't let you bargain with God in the passenger seat. One moment he was standing at the counter, pouring himself coffee, grumbling about the price of eggs like he always did. The next moment, he was gripping the edge of the countertop like the world had suddenly tilted, and then he was on the floor. People always say they remember details in a crisis. I remember the mug rolling away. I remember the coffee spreading across the tile in a dark, slow bloom. I remember how strangely quiet the house sounded when I screamed his name over and over, as if volume could pull him back. The paramedics did what they could. They were kind. They were practiced. They looked at me with that careful softness people use when they've already decided your life has changed. At the funeral, I stood beside the casket and accepted condolences like they were paper cups being placed into my hands. He was such a good man. He took such good care of you. You must be lost without him. And I nodded. I thanked them. I held myself together. Here's the part I don't say out loud very often. I didn't cry the way a widow is supposed to cry. I cried later in small private bursts, when I found one of his shirts hanging in the closet, still smelling faintly of his aftershave, or when the evening news came on and I realized no one was going to complain about the anchor's voice anymore. But at the funeral, in front of everyone, I felt blank. Worse than blank, if I'm being honest. I felt a flicker of relief that scared me. Relief is a terrible thing to feel when someone dies, especially someone you built a life with. It makes you question your own heart. It makes you wonder what kind of person you are. But that flicker was there, and it was real, like a candle you don't want to admit you've lit. Maybe it was just relief that the long years of worry were over, because even in a stable marriage, there are things you swallow. There are silences you learn to live inside. There are parts of your life that get smaller without you noticing, until one day you can't remember the last time you made a decision without checking someone else's face first. 3 days after the funeral, a letter arrived. It was from the bank. I almost tossed it onto the pile with the sympathy cards and the donation notices. In the first week after a death, mail feels like an insult. Bills and advertisements marching into your grief like they own the place. But this envelope looked official, the paper thicker, the logo crisp, the kind of thing you should open even when your hands are shaking. "Mrs. Sullivan," it began, "please be advised that you are the co-owner of Safe Deposit Box, Art 847. I read that line 3 times. Co-owner. Safe Deposit Box. Art 847. My first thought was simple. We don't have a safe deposit box. My second thought was even simpler and colder. Bob had a safe deposit box. I sat at the kitchen table with that letter in my hands, and I could hear the clock ticking like it was counting down to something. The same clock Bob used to check before leaving every Tuesday. Keep the future safe. My stomach tightened, as if my body knew what my mind was still trying to refuse. In 38 years of marriage, Bob had never mentioned a safe deposit box. Not once. He told me when he refinanced the house. He told me when he changed insurance policies. He told me when he bought a new set of tires. But this? This he kept to himself. I called our son, David, because that's what you do when something makes you feel suddenly small. David is 36. Practical, with Bob's steady way of thinking and my habit of worrying in silence. He came over that evening, brought groceries I didn't ask for, and sat across from me at the table while I slid the letter to him like it was evidence. He read it, frowned, and looked up. "Mom," he said, "why would Dad put you as co-owner and not tell you?" I didn't have an answer that made sense. I heard myself say, maybe it's nothing, maybe it's old. Maybe he forgot. David didn't nod the way people nod when they agree. He nodded the way people nod when they're deciding to do something anyway. "We're going to the bank," he said. I wanted to say no. I wanted to keep the future safe, the way Bob always claimed he did, by keeping the lid on, by leaving things unopened. But the letter sat between us, plain and undeniable, and something in me, some stubborn, tired part, rose up and said, "Not this time." That night, after David left, I walked through the house with the kind of quiet you only hear after someone is gone. I stopped in front of Bob's desk. His pens were lined up the way he liked them. The drawer was closed. The chair was pushed in. Everything looked orderly, like his life had ended mid-sentence, but his furniture hadn't gotten the memo. I stared at that desk and thought about Tuesdays at 2:09 p.m. For 38 years, I watched him leave the house with the same measured steps, the same calm expression. I watched him come back, set his keys in the same ceramic dish, and ask what we were having for dinner. And not once, never once did I ask, "What exactly are you doing at the bank every Tuesday?" Because I trusted him. Because I loved him. Because in our world, a woman didn't interrogate a man who said he was keeping their future safe. The next morning, I laid the letter on the counter, found my purse, and put on my coat like I was going somewhere ordinary. But my hands were trembling at the buttons. I told myself it would be simple. A document. A form. Something routine. Still, as I locked the front door and stepped off the porch, I had the strangest sensation, like I was walking toward a room in my own house I'd never been allowed to enter. And for the first time since Bob died, I felt something sharp and clear cut through the fog of grief. Not sadness, not anger, curiosity. The kind that says, if my whole life was built on truth, this will prove it. And if it wasn't, I'm about to find out. The bank was only 10 minutes from our house, but that morning it felt like we were driving somewhere far away. Someplace you don't go unless you have to. David drove. I sat in the passenger seat with my hands folded in my lap like a polite child, staring out at streets I'd known for decades and noticing things I'd never noticed before. Cracks in the sidewalks, a shuttered diner, a for lease sign hanging crooked in the window of a shop that used to sell wedding gifts. Life keeps going, I thought, even when yours doesn't feel like it can. David glanced at me at a red light. "You okay?" I almost said yes. That old reflex. Make it easy for other people, don't cause worry, don't take up too much space. But the truth was heavier than politeness. "I don't know," I admitted. "I feel foolish, like I should have known." David's jaw tightened. Mom, don't start blaming yourself before we even know what this is. That's the thing about children, even grown ones. They speak with a confidence that makes you remember who you used to be before you learn to smooth everything down. We walked into the bank and the air hit me with that familiar mix of disinfectant and paper and faint perfume. I'd been in plenty of banks, of course, but always for obvious things. Deposit a check, ask a question, sign a form that Bob had already filled out. This time I felt exposed, as if everyone could see the letter in my purse and the questions in my face. A young teller smiled at us. "How can I help you today?" David leaned in slightly. "My father passed away," he said gently, and even hearing him say it out loud made my throat tighten. "We received a letter about a safe deposit box. My mother is listed as co-owner." The teller's expression shifted. Sympathy on the surface, professionalism underneath. "I'm very sorry for your loss. Let me get my manager." We waited near a small seating area that had magazines no one ever read and a fake plant gathering dust. My eyes kept drifting to the clock on the wall. It was 11:22 a.m. On Tuesdays, Bob would have been here in 2 hours and 38 minutes. A woman in her 50s approached us, her hair neatly cut, her name tag reading Patricia Holland. She shook our hands and looked directly at me. "Mrs. Sullivan," she said, voice quiet. "I'm sorry about Robert." "Thank you," I whispered, and my voice sounded smaller than I wanted it to. Patricia led us to her office. The door closed with a soft click that felt too final. She asked for my ID. She asked for Bob's death certificate. She spoke in that careful tone people use when they're handling something delicate, like fine china or someone else's grief. After a few minutes of typing and checking documents, she looked up. "Yes," she said. "You are the co-owner of Box 847. "How long?" I asked before I could stop myself. Patricia paused, like she was measuring what she could say. "The box was opened 38 years ago." 38. The number landed like a stone in my chest. That was the year we got married. David's eyebrows shot up. "So he had it the entire time." Patricia nodded. "It appears so." I felt my hands go cold. My own wedding year, my own life, stamped into a record I'd never seen. Patricia continued, "Because you're listed as co-owner, you have access. If you'd like to open it today, we can take you to the vault." David looked at me. "Mom?" I heard myself say yes. I don't know where the steadiness came from, but it showed up like a stranger stepping forward when you can't. Patricia led us down a hallway that I'd never walked before, past doors marked, "Authorized personnel only." The bank suddenly felt less like a place for friendly transactions, and more like a place where secrets lived. She stopped at a heavy door, entered a code, turned a key, and opened it with a weight that made my stomach tighten again. Inside, the vault was cooler, the air denser. Rows and rows of metal boxes sat like silent mouths, each one holding somebody's hidden life. Patricia found the number, 847, pulled out the box, and carried it to a small private room with a table and a lamp. She set it down between us. "There are 2 keys required," she explained. "The bank's key and the owner's key." My heart thudded. "I don't have a key." David said, "We found 1 key on Dad's ring, but we weren't sure what it was for." He reached into his pocket and held out a small brass key. Suddenly, the key looked different in his hand, no longer just an object, but a question Bob had kept tucked away in plain sight. Patricia nodded. "That's likely it." She inserted the bank's key, then gestured for me. My fingers hovered over the brass key. I swear for a moment I could feel Bob's hand on mine, guiding, controlling, steadying. It made me angry in a way I couldn't name. Not rage, more like a sharp refusal. I slid the key into the lock and turned it. There was a soft, mechanical click. Patricia removed the metal box and placed it on the table. "I'll step outside," she said. "Take your time. If you need me, just open the door." Then she left, and the room became very quiet. David sat beside me, but even with him there, it felt like I was alone with something enormous. The box was heavier than I expected. Plain, unremarkable, the kind of thing you'd never look at and think, this holds the truth of a marriage. I opened the lid. Inside were folders, several of them, thick with papers, a few envelopes, some sealed, some not, a small notebook with a worn black cover, and at the very bottom a letter in Bob's handwriting, folded carefully like he'd practiced. I didn't touch the letter first. I don't know why. Maybe because part of me still wanted to give Bob the benefit of speaking for himself, and another part of me refused to let him control the order of the story. I lifted the top folder. The first page was a statement, then another, and another. At first, my brain tried to make it ordinary. I told myself these were insurance papers, investment accounts, retirement documents, something responsible. But as I flipped through, the numbers began to tell a different story. There were account summaries I didn't recognize. There were transactions that made no sense. Withdrawals, transfers, fees, and on one page, a line of text that made my vision blur for a moment. Balance, $43. I stared at it like it was a typo. We were not rich, but we were comfortable. Bob had always said we were comfortable. We owned our home. We had savings. We were fine. David leaned over my shoulder. What is that? I don't know. My mouth went dry. I opened another folder. More statements, different institutions. Some had our names. Some had only Bob's. Some had my name on them. Accounts I had never opened. David's voice sharpened. Mom, look at this. He pointed to a page that listed a retirement fund, the kind of account Bob talked about the way other men talked about football scores. He'd mention it once in a while, like it was a promise. Don't worry, Maggie, we're set for retirement. The statement showed nothing. No comforting total, no steady growth. It was as if the account had been drained and left behind like an empty glass. I felt a kind of dizziness, like my body couldn't keep up with the shift in reality. My hands began to tremble so hard I had to press them against the table. David turned another page. This can't be right. I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe there was a rational explanation, something a bank could correct, a mistake that could be fixed with a phone call and an apology. But the more pages we looked at, the less room there was for innocence. There were loan documents. My name appeared on them, typed neatly like a fact. The amounts made my stomach drop, tens of thousands, then more, then a figure that made me gasp, home equity line of credit, on our house. David's face went pale. Dad took out a loan on the house? I could barely breathe. He wouldn't do that without telling me. The words didn't make it out of my mouth, because right there in black ink was my name, and next to it, my signature. Only it wasn't my signature. It was close enough to fool someone who didn't know me, a slant like mine, a loop like mine. But I knew my own hand. I knew the way my M curled, the way the G dipped. This signature was an imitation, a performance of me. My throat made a sound I didn't recognize, half gasp, half laugh, half sob. David stared. Mom, that's not your signature. No, I whispered. It's not. I looked down at those pages and felt something crack open inside me. Not grief this time, but betrayal so sharp it was almost clean. In that moment, the Tuesday ritual stopped being a quirky habit. It became a trail. It became evidence. 38 years of keeping the future safe. And here we were in a bank's private room, staring at proof that the future we'd been promised might have been built on air. David carefully gathered the papers into neat stacks, like he was trying to impose order on chaos. We need copies, he said. We need all of this. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what I was agreeing to. My mind felt split in two. One part of me was still the wife who wanted to protect Bob's reputation, who wanted to tell myself he had reasons, he had pressure, he was scared. The other part was a woman looking at her own forged name and realizing something terrible. The man I trusted most in the world had been willing to use me, and we hadn't even opened the letter yet. I wish I could tell you I stood up right then and marched out of that little room with my chin high and my mind clear. I wish I could say I became a different kind of woman in an instant, the kind who never lets anyone hide anything from her again. The truth is, I sat there for a long time staring at the papers because my body didn't know what to do with a betrayal that wore my husband's face. David was the one who moved first. He opened the door and called Patricia back in, his voice steady in that way that reminds you he's Bob's son as much as he's mine. "Can we make copies of everything in the box?" he asked. Patricia's expression tightened. She didn't look shocked exactly. Banks see a lot, I suppose, but she did look cautious, as if she could feel the air in the room had changed. "Of course," she said. "We can arrange that." She stepped out to coordinate it. While she was gone, David and I worked through the contents, piece by piece, like we were sorting through the wreckage of a house after a storm. There were credit card statements, so many of them, accounts I'd never heard of, fees I didn't recognize, and on several of them, my name printed neatly at the top, Margaret Sullivan. Some of the purchases were mundane, the kind of thing you could explain away, hardware store charges, insurance payments, a restaurant bill here and there, but others were large withdrawals, cash advances, and payments to lenders I'd never heard of. Seeing those lines felt like watching someone else spend my life. Then we found the applications. There were forms with my personal information, my social security number, my date of birth, my employment history. Details Bob could have filled out in his sleep because he'd been beside me for decades. Next to the printed name was the same imitation signature we'd just seen. I pressed a hand to my chest because my heart felt like it was misfiring. All those years I believed our finances were taken care of. He'd been taking them from me. David flipped to another section and went very still. "Mom," he said softly, "there's more." He slid a packet across the table. At the top was something called a promissory note. Underneath it were pages titled Loan Agreement, Security Instrument, and other words that felt like a foreign language, even though they were about my own home. And there, over and over again, was our address, our front porch, our living room. The place where I'd raised my children and hung curtains and hosted Thanksgiving dinners and watched my grandchildren toddle across the rug. Collateral. I stared at the amount on the page until the numbers blurred. It was more money than I'd ever borrowed in my life. More money than I'd ever agreed to borrow. "Home equity," David whispered, like saying it quietly could make it less real. I felt my mouth go numb. "But why would he—" My voice broke off. The question wasn't, why would he? Not really. The question was, how could he? How could a man who kissed my forehead every night, who called me Mags with that familiar warmth, who checked the locks and told me we were safe, how could he sign my name to debt and call it love? I reached for the small black notebook and opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were handwritten notes, columns of figures, dates, many of them Tuesdays. There were arrows, circles, and the kind of shorthand Bob used when he didn't expect anyone else to read it. At the back of the notebook, a few lines stood out, written heavier, the ink pressed harder into the paper as if his hand had been shaking. "Fix it before she knows. Pay minimum, buy time. Don't let it reach Maggie." I read those lines twice, and then I couldn't see the page anymore. David's voice was far away. "Mom, sit back. Breathe." I realized I was leaning forward like my body was trying to crawl out of itself. Then, at the bottom of the box, the letter waited. Bob's handwriting looked so familiar it made my stomach twist. Same careful loops, same calm slant, the same hand that used to write grocery lists and birthday cards and notes that said, "Love you," on the kitchen counter when he left early. I unfolded it slowly, like it might burn me. "Maggie," it began. Just my name, plain and intimate, and I felt a surge of anger so sudden my hands shook harder. He wrote that he was sorry. He wrote that he never meant for it to go this far. He wrote that 5 years earlier he'd made one mistake, an investment that went wrong. He said it started as an effort to increase our savings, to protect our retirement, to give us more. Then the market turned, the returns vanished, and he was left with losses he couldn't admit out loud. I thought I could fix it, he wrote. I thought if I just kept working at it, if I just rearranged things, I could protect you from the worry. Every Tuesday at 2 p.m., he said, he went to the bank to move money, to borrow, to refinance, to make payments, to delay the moment the truth would catch up. He called it buying time. He did not call it what it was, lying, forgery, theft. He wrote that he didn't tell me because he couldn't bear the shame. He wrote that he did it because he loved me. And then, near the end, he wrote the sentence that made my throat tighten like a fist. I couldn't live with you knowing what I'd done. I stared at those words. There is a kind of cowardice in that sentence that people don't talk about enough. He couldn't live with me knowing, so he chose to leave me with the mess and the shame and the wreckage, and he'd already made sure, with his death, that he wouldn't have to face my eyes. I folded the letter back up and set it on the table very carefully, like it might explode. David looked at me. His face was tense, and I could see the fight in him. Part grief, part fury, part disbelief. What do we do? He asked. For a moment, I honestly didn't know. In the space of an hour, my husband had become a stranger. My marriage had become a crime scene. My name, my own name, had become something Bob could copy and use like a tool. And yet he was dead. That made the betrayal feel both heavier and more slippery, like you couldn't even grab it properly. You can't argue with a gravestone. You can't demand accountability from a heart that stopped beating. Patricia returned with copies and forms, and I heard myself speaking in a voice that sounded too calm for what was happening. I need copies of everything, I told her, and I need to know exactly what accounts are in my name. Patricia nodded, her eyes shifting briefly to the forged signatures. She didn't accuse, she didn't comfort, she just did what banks do, documented. By the time we left, I had a thick envelope of copies that felt like it weighed as much as a brick. The drive home was silent. David's hands were tight on the steering wheel. My gaze kept drifting to the clock on the dashboard. 2 p.m. came and went. No Bob, no bank, no ritual, just me sitting in the passenger seat, feeling like my life had been quietly dismantled and I hadn't heard the screws coming loose. When we got home, David helped me spread the papers out on the dining room table. It looked like an investigation board. Statements, applications, loan agreements, my whole marriage reduced to ink and numbers. Then David asked a practical question that should have been simple. Mom, he said, do you know if Dad had life insurance? Life insurance, the thing that's supposed to catch you when you fall. Bob had always talked about being responsible, about planning, about making sure we were covered. I think so, I said automatically. He wouldn't leave us without... I stopped myself because I'd already said he wouldn't too many times that day. David made a few calls. He logged into accounts Bob had left behind. He searched through files. Then he looked up at me, his face grim. Mom, he said, there isn't one. For a moment, my brain refused to accept it. No life insurance, no safety net, just debt. I stared at the papers again and felt something in me shift. It wasn't hysteria. It wasn't collapse. It was a slow, hard settling, the way ground settles after an earthquake. You realize the shaking is over, but your house is not the same shape anymore. I looked at my son, my child, who shouldn't have to carry this, and I heard myself speak in a voice I barely recognized, low, steady, almost flat. Okay, I said, sit down. We're going to handle this. David blinked. Mom, are you sure you're... I'm sure of one thing, I said, and I could feel the words coming from a place that had been quiet inside me for a very long time. I'm not going to protect his secret anymore. There are moments in life when you realize you've been living by a set of rules you never agreed to, just inherited. Rules about loyalty, rules about marriage, rules about what a good woman does when a man makes mistakes. I looked at the forged signature again. I looked at the debt tied to my home, and something inside me, the part that had once been young and stubborn and independent, sat up like it had been asleep for decades. I need a lawyer, I said. David exhaled slowly, relief mixed with anger. Yes, he agreed. We do. That night, after David left, I sat alone at the dining room table with the papers spread out like a map of disaster. The house creaked in its familiar ways. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. Bob's chair at the table was empty, and for once, instead of feeling only grief, I felt the full weight of what he had stolen. Not just money, not just security. He had stolen my right to choose the truth. And I made myself a promise right there, under the harsh dining room light with my hands still shaking. Whatever happens next, I will not be kept in the dark. The next morning, I woke up with that strange, brittle energy you get after a night of little sleep and too much thinking. Grief had turned into something else, something sharper. I made coffee I didn't want, sat at the table I'd sat at for 38 years, and stared at papers that made my marriage look like a ledger full of lies. If you've never been in this kind of situation, you might imagine it like a movie, screaming, throwing things, sobbing in the shower. But for me, it felt more like walking through fog with a flashlight that keeps flickering on. Every time it lit up, I saw something I couldn't unsee. David came back around 9. He'd already done more research in 12 hours than I'd done in 12 years. He had names of attorneys, phone numbers, a list of questions. He said, "Mom, we need someone who deals with fraud, identity theft, family stuff, the way people soften the language when the truth is too ugly." I nodded. "Call the first one." The attorney's office was on the second floor of an older building downtown, above a dry cleaner and across from a bakery that smelled like cinnamon and butter even in winter. That scent followed me up the stairs, and I remember thinking, how strange that the world can smell sweet while your life is cracking open. Her name was Jennifer Rodriguez, late 40s, sharp eyes, calm voice. She didn't greet me like I was fragile. She greeted me like I was a client. "Mrs. Sullivan," she said, "I'm sorry for your loss, and I'm sorry you're here under these circumstances." She offered water. David sat beside me, papers stacked neatly on his lap. Jennifer opened a legal pad and waited. I told her about the letter from the bank, about the safe deposit box, about the forged signature. I tried to keep my voice steady, but there were moments it wobbled, especially when I mentioned the house. Jennifer didn't interrupt. She didn't make that pity face people make when they don't know what to do with your pain. She let the facts land. When I finished, she asked, "Do you have copies of everything?" David slid the envelope across the desk. Jennifer flipped through the documents, her eyes moving quickly, the way Bob's used to move across spreadsheets. She stopped at the forged signature and frowned. "This is serious," she said. I swallowed. "I know." "No," she said gently but firmly. "I mean legally serious. Not just your husband made mistakes. This is fraud, and if he opened credit cards in your name without your permission, that's identity theft." The words identity theft made my stomach turn. I'd heard the phrase on commercials, the kind with cheerful warnings and toll-free numbers, as if it was something that happened to other people in big cities. Not to a retired woman in a quiet neighborhood who thought her biggest financial worry was the price of prescriptions. Jennifer set her pen down and looked straight at me. "There's a term for what you're describing," she said. "It's called spousal financial abuse." Abuse. That word hit me harder than I expected. I almost argued with it out of reflex. Bob never hit me. Bob never screamed. Bob wasn't a drunk. Bob didn't gamble in a casino. Bob took out the trash and fixed the leaky faucet and kissed my cheek when he left the house. But Jennifer continued, and her voice stayed even, like she'd explained this 100 times. "Financial abuse isn't always loud," she said. "Sometimes it's control. Sometimes it's secrecy. Sometimes it's using someone's name and credit without permission. Sometimes it's leaving them trapped in debt so they have no options." I thought of all the times Bob said, "Don't worry, Maggie, I've got it." I thought of how small my world had become around that sentence. David's voice tightened. "So what can we do?" Jennifer tapped one of the loan documents. First, we need to separate what is legally yours from what was done to you. If your signature was forged, we can challenge these debts, but we have to move quickly, because creditors won't wait just because you're grieving. The word creditors made my skin prickle. It sounded like wolves at the edge of the yard. Jennifer started listing steps, and I felt my mind scrambling to keep up. We'll pull your credit reports from the major bureaus, she said. We'll identify every account in your name. We'll put fraud alerts in place. We'll notify the lenders in writing that these accounts were opened without authorization, and we'll file a police report. A police report? I repeated. I didn't like how that sounded. Police reports are for crimes. Crimes are committed by criminals. Criminals are not your husband of 38 years. My chest tightened around that thought like a band. Jennifer watched my face carefully. I know it's hard to hear, she said, but the system requires certain steps. The creditors will ask for documentation. A police report isn't about punishing him. He's gone. It's about protecting you. Protecting me. For the first time in days, those words didn't feel like a lie. I nodded slowly. Okay. Jennifer leaned back slightly. Now, about the home equity loan. That will be the hardest part. Because it's the house, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Yes, she said. A mortgage lender will argue that you benefited from the money, even if you didn't know about it. They'll say the funds went to household expenses or to payments that kept the home running, and therefore you share responsibility. David frowned. But it was forged. Jennifer nodded. That matters. A lot. But lenders are aggressive, and they have attorneys too. I stared at my hands. The skin looked thinner than it used to. Older hands, hands that had made dinners and folded laundry and held babies, hands that had signed permission slips and Christmas cards, hands that had not signed those loans. What are my chances? I asked. Jennifer didn't give me a fairy tale. She didn't tell me what I wanted to hear. That's one reason I think I trusted her. It depends on the evidence, she said. But you have something many people don't. Documentation in a safe deposit box, a pattern of activity, and if that letter is what you say it is, a written admission. David sat up. The letter. I reached into my purse and pulled it out, folded neatly like a bomb I'd been carrying around. Jennifer read it carefully, her face giving nothing away. When she finished, she set it down and exhaled. This is significant, she said. It's not a legal confession in the way television makes it look, but it supports your story. It shows intent. It shows a pattern. It shows he knew he was hiding it from you. I felt my throat tighten, not with sadness this time, but with a kind of sick vindication. There it was in his own handwriting. He didn't want me to know. Jennifer began outlining next steps. She spoke about letters to creditors, deadlines, and the possibility of court. She used phrases like dispute process and evidence packet. She made the chaos sound like something you could organize, but then she asked, "How is your daughter handling this?" The question surprised me. Emily? Jennifer nodded. Financial abuse in marriage doesn't just affect the spouse. It affects the family system. People react differently. Some get angry, some get defensive, some go into denial. Denial. I'd already felt it in my own body, the part of me that wanted to keep Bob's image intact like a framed photograph that must not be knocked off the mantel. I sighed. She doesn't know everything yet. David glanced at me, and I knew what he was thinking. We should tell her now. We should have told her yesterday. She loved her father, I said, feeling the familiar ache. She always said he made her feel safe. Jennifer nodded slowly. Then this will feel like someone kicked the foundation out from under her. Be prepared for anger. Sometimes it's easier for adult children to blame the parent who's still alive because they can't confront the one who's gone. Those words sat heavy in the room. I could already picture Emily's face, the way it would harden, the way she'd say, "You're being dramatic. You're trying to ruin him." I swallowed. I don't want to turn my children against their father. Jennifer's gaze stayed steady. Mrs. Sullivan telling the truth isn't turning them against him. He made choices. The truth is just the consequence of those choices. I looked away. I hated how reasonable that sounded. Before we left, Jennifer slid a simple agreement across the desk and explained her fees. I signed, my real signature this time, slow and careful, as if I were reminding myself what my own hand looked like. Outside, the air was cold enough to make my eyes water. David walked beside me, silent. When we reached the car, he asked quietly, "Mom, are you okay?" I stared at the bakery across the street, at the old couple inside sharing a pastry at a small table, their heads bent close together like two birds sheltering from the wind. "I don't know what I am," I said. "I feel like I'm watching my life from the outside." David nodded. "But we're doing something." "Yes," I said, and that word felt like a rope I could hold on to. "We are." When I got home, the phone rang. It was Emily. I stared at the caller ID for a long moment before picking up. My heart felt like it was bracing for impact. "Mom?" Her voice sounded tight. "David said you went to a lawyer." I closed my eyes. So he'd told her, or she'd sensed something. Emily always sensed things, even as a little girl. "Yes," I said carefully. A pause. Then, sharp as a slap. "Why are you doing this?" My chest tightened. Because there are debts, Emily. Debts in my name. On the house." She scoffed, and I could hear the tears beneath it. "Dad would never do that. He loved you." The sentence was so familiar it almost knocked me backwards in time. Loved you. As if love is proof of innocence. As if love cancels out paper and ink and forged signatures. "Emily," I said softly, "I have documents." "I don't want to see documents," she snapped. "I want you to stop. He's gone, Mom. Let him rest. Let him rest." And there it was, the pressure to protect him, even now. Even when he'd left me holding the bag. I felt my voice steady in a way that surprised me. "I'm not doing this to punish your father," I said. "I'm doing this so I can live." Silence on the line. Then quieter, wounded. "You're making him into a monster." I swallowed hard, because part of me wanted to say, "No, sweetheart, he wasn't a monster. He was your dad. He was my husband. He was complicated." But another part of me, the part that saw my name forged, my house used, my future risked, refused to lie. "I'm not making him anything," I said. "I'm just finally looking." Emily hung up. The click in my ear sounded like a door closing. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, staring at nothing, feeling the sting of that rupture. I'd expected grief. I hadn't expected to lose my daughter's trust on top of everything else. But I also felt something else beneath the pain, a clear understanding that this was what the truth costs. And if I was going to survive what Bob had done, I couldn't afford to pay that cost by going back into silence. After Emily hung up on me, the house felt different, not because the furniture moved or the walls changed, but because the air did. There are silences you choose, and then there are silences that get forced on you. That one was forced. It sat heavy in every room, like a winter coat you can't take off. The next few days became a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and a kind of emotional whiplash I didn't know a person could survive. I learned new routines, ones Bob had never taught me, because Bob had never wanted me to know they existed. Every morning I woke up and checked my phone the way I used to check the weather. Not for sunshine or rain, but for messages from Jennifer, for alerts from credit bureaus, for voicemails from creditors with voices that were polite on the surface and predatory underneath. Jennifer moved quickly. She had her staff pull my credit reports, and when the results came in, she called me herself. "Maggie," she said, "there are more accounts than you think." I sat at the table with a pen in my hand and listened as she listed them. Every time she said another company name, it felt like someone was adding another stone to a sack on my back. Some balances were small, some were enormous, and all of them had one thing in common. They weren't mine. Jennifer had me file a police report for identity theft. Walking into the station was one of the strangest experiences of my life. I remember sitting on a hard chair under fluorescent lights, hands clasped so tightly my knuckles hurt, trying to explain to a young officer, young enough to be my grandson, that my husband had been forging my signature. He looked uncomfortable. I don't blame him. People don't like imagining a crime happening in a marriage. They prefer the story where everything is private and complicated, and no one has to say the words out loud. But I said them. Yes, I told him, my voice flat. He did it without my permission. Writing that report felt like dragging Bob's name into a place it didn't belong. For a moment, I almost stopped myself, but then I pictured those loan documents, the imitation signature, the sentence in Bob's letter, "Fix it before she knows." And I kept going. A week later, the first small victory arrived in the mail. It was a letter from one of the credit card companies. Jennifer had sent them a dispute packet, copies of the forged signature, the police report, my sworn statement. The letter said they had determined the account was fraudulent and would be removed from my credit report. I read the sentence 3 times, not because I didn't understand it, but because I needed to feel it sink in. Removed. A weight off my back. Not the whole load, but enough to make me breathe again. David came over that evening, and I held the letter out to him like it was a medal. "That's one," he said, and for the first time in days, he smiled, a small, tired smile. "One," I agreed. "You don't realize how much you've taken for granted until you're fighting for scraps of normalcy. That letter didn't erase what Bob had done. It didn't repair my relationship with Emily. It didn't guarantee I'd keep my home. But it proved something important. The truth could actually change things. The system might be slow, but it wasn't completely deaf." Then came the harder calls. Some creditors were reasonable. They listened. They investigated. They removed debts once the evidence was clear. Others were like dealing with a brick wall that spoke in scripted sentences. "I'm sorry, ma'am," one representative told me, voice smooth as oil. "But the account was used for household expenses. That indicates shared benefit?" Shared benefit. As if I'd enjoyed being lied to. As if I'd sat down at the table and toasted to the idea of my credit being destroyed. Jennifer warned me about that phrase. "They'll try to argue you benefited," she said, "especially with the home equity loan." The home equity loan was the monster under the bed. Everything else, credit cards, personal loans, felt like it could be battled with letters and documentation. But the loan on the house was different. It had teeth. The lender's attorney called Jennifer and said, essentially, that the loan was valid because the money had been deposited into an account connected to the household and used to make payments that kept the home afloat. They didn't care that the signature was forged. They cared about recovering their money. It was the first time I truly understood what people mean when they say a system can be unfair, not unfair in a dramatic, screaming way. Unfair in a calm, paperwork-heavy way, where the person with the most resources can keep pushing until you get too tired to push back. Jennifer told me we would likely have to go to court. After she said it, I sat in my kitchen and stared at the wall for a long time. Court sounded like something that happened to other people, people with messy divorces or businesses that went bankrupt or kids in trouble. Not me. I was the woman who baked casserole for funerals. I was the woman who signed birthday cards and used coupons. But apparently, I was also the woman whose signature had been forged. One afternoon, while David was at my house helping me organize paperwork, he went quiet in the middle of sorting a stack of statements. He kept tapping his finger on the table, a nervous habit he'd had since he was a teenager. "What is it?" I asked. He hesitated. "I need to tell you something." His voice sounded different, like a man stepping into a confession booth. I put down the papers. "Tell me." He swallowed. "Dad asked me for money. Not recently, a few years ago." My stomach dropped. "What?" David rubbed the back of his neck. "He didn't call it that. He said he had an investment opportunity. He said it was safe. He said it was a sure thing, and he wanted me to get in early." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I felt like someone had opened another hidden room in the house, another place I'd never been allowed. "How much?" I finally asked. 50,000, David said, and the words sounded like they scraped his throat on the way out. I almost did it. I stared at him, stunned. "David, why didn't you tell me?" He looked ashamed. "Because I didn't do it. Sarah talked me out of it. She said it didn't make sense. Dad was pushing too hard, and it felt off." Sarah, my daughter-in-law. The woman I'd always thought was kind and sensible and quietly strong. A woman who had, without meaning to, saved my son from stepping into the same trap. David's eyes were wet. "I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't want to worry you, and I didn't want to believe Dad was—" He stopped himself, jaw clenched. I didn't want to believe he was desperate. Desperate. That word fit Bob better than evil. It made the story easier to hold. It also made me furious, because desperation does not give you the right to steal someone's identity. Desperation does not give you the right to gamble your family's home without telling them they're sitting at the table. I reached across and took David's hand. "You did the right thing," I told him. "And Sarah did too." He nodded, wiping his face quickly like he didn't want to be seen crying. I just keep thinking, how deep was he in that he'd ask me? Deep enough, I thought, to do anything. That night, after David left, I opened the cupboard and stared at my pantry like it might contain an answer. The truth was, I didn't just need a lawyer, I needed income. For most of my marriage, I worked, off and on. But in the last few years, I'd slowed down. Bob said we didn't need it. He said we were comfortable. He said he had our future safe. I thought of those words like they were shards of glass in my mouth. The next day, I put on a decent sweater, combed my hair, and drove to the little bookstore on Maple Street, the one I'd always loved because it smelled like paper and quiet and time. I didn't go in with a grand plan. I went in because it was the only place I could imagine myself being useful without feeling like a burden. The owner, Ruth, was behind the counter. She was about my age, maybe a bit older, with gray hair pulled back and reading glasses perched on her head like a crown. She looked up and smiled. "Maggie Sullivan," she said. "I haven't seen you in a while." I tried to smile back. "I've had a lot going on." Ruth's eyes softened in a way that told me she already knew about Bob. In a town like ours, news moves faster than mail. "I'm looking for work," I said. And hearing myself say it felt surreal, like I was playing a role in someone else's life. Part-time? Anything. Ruth didn't rush to pity me. She didn't ask 100 questions. She studied my face for a moment, like she was reading a page she'd seen before. "Can you start tomorrow?" she asked. I blinked. "Tomorrow?" She nodded. "I can always use help. Shelving, inventory, running the register, and—" She paused. "It helps to have a place to go when your house feels too quiet." My throat tightened. Ruth had said it like it was simple, like it was ordinary for a woman to rebuild herself at 64. "I can start tomorrow," I whispered. That first day at the bookstore, my hands shook when I rang up a purchase. Not because it was hard, but because it felt like reclaiming something. My own time, my own money, my own ability to stand in the world without Bob's shadow behind me. During my lunch break, Ruth sat with me in the little back room where boxes of new arrivals were stacked against the wall. She poured tea into chipped mugs and said, very casually, "Men can be good and still do terrible things." I looked at her, startled. She didn't elaborate right away. She just sipped her tea, eyes on the steam. Then she said, "My first husband kept a second life from me. Not money, another woman. For years." The room seemed to go quiet around her confession. "I'm sorry," I said automatically. Ruth waved a hand. "Don't be. I survived it. But I learned something I wish I'd known earlier. People will call it love while they're hurting you, because it makes them feel less guilty." Her words settled into me like medicine that stings going down. That afternoon, when I went home, there were 3 new voicemails from lenders, and for the first time I listened to them without feeling like I might faint. I wasn't fixed. I wasn't healed. I wasn't suddenly fearless, but I was moving. Every day, Jennifer and I chipped away at the smaller debts. Every day, the home equity loan loomed like a storm cloud. Every day, Emily stayed silent. And every day, I showed up at the bookstore, earned an hourly wage, and felt something inside me slowly return. The sense that my life still belonged to me, even if I had to fight for it, line by line. Court doesn't look the way it does on television, not in a town like ours. There are no dramatic gasps, no pounding gavels every 5 minutes, no speeches that make the room erupt. It looks like beige walls and hard benches and people shuffling papers like their lives are just folders to be moved from one stack to another. But when your name is on the paperwork, it doesn't feel beige at all. It feels like standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting to see if the ground holds. Jennifer told me to dress simply. "You want to look like yourself," she said, "not like you're performing." So I wore a navy cardigan, the one I used to wear to parent-teacher meetings. I pinned my hair back the way I always did when I needed to feel composed. David came with me. He didn't say much on the drive, just kept his hands tight on the wheel, jaw set, like he was trying to keep all his feelings from spilling out. We met Jennifer outside the courthouse. She looked calm, as always, holding a slim briefcase, her posture straight. I envied that steadiness. I felt like my heart was a bird trapped in my ribs. Inside, we sat on a wooden bench while Jennifer spoke quietly with another attorney, a man in a gray suit representing the lender. He didn't look at me the way you look at a person. He looked at me the way you look at a problem. When the judge came in, everyone stood. The room moved like one body. Then we sat again and the case began. Jennifer did most of the talking. That was the agreement from the start. I would not have to argue my own pain like it was a debate. Still, I listened to every word as if it might decide whether I had a home to go back to. The lender's attorney started with what Jennifer had warned me about, the benefit argument. "Mrs. Sullivan lived in the home," he said, voice polite, steady. "The funds were used to maintain household obligations. It's reasonable to conclude she benefited from the loan, regardless of how the documents were signed." It was a calm sentence. It sounded almost harmless. But I felt it like a slap, benefited. As if I'd been handed a gift, not a trap. Jennifer stood and spoke with a controlled intensity that reminded me of a nurse in an emergency room, focused, efficient, unimpressed by nonsense. "Your Honor," she said, "this isn't a case of a spouse disagreeing about finances. This is a case of documented forgery and identity theft. The loan documents contain a signature that is not Mrs. Sullivan's. There are credit accounts opened in her name without her authorization. There is a police report. There are disputed accounts already removed from her credit file based on lender investigations." She placed copies of documents on the table in front of the judge. I watched the judge's eyes move across the pages. Slow, careful, the way a person reads when they know the truth matters. Then Jennifer did something I hadn't expected. She held up Bob's letter. "This," she said, "is a written admission by the late Mr. Sullivan that he concealed the financial situation from his wife and engaged in conduct to buy time without her knowledge." The lender's attorney objected. Jennifer responded. The judge listened. I sat very still, hands folded in my lap, reminding myself to breathe. Finally, Jennifer turned slightly and looked at me. "Mrs. Sullivan," she said, "I'm going to ask you a few questions." My throat tightened. My palms went damp. I stood when she asked me to. My knees felt weak, but I didn't want anyone to see it. I walked to the front and raised my right hand and swore to tell the truth. The words felt strange in my mouth, because I'd spent so many years avoiding truth to keep peace. Jennifer's questions were simple, direct. "Mrs. Sullivan, did you sign these loan documents?" "No," I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "Did you authorize your husband to sign on your behalf?" "No." "Did you know this home equity line of credit existed before your husband's death?" "No." The lender's attorney cross-examined me next. He didn't yell. He didn't insult me outright. He did something colder. He implied, "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, "you and your husband shared a home. You shared bills. You shared a life. Isn't it possible you knew more than you're saying, but you simply didn't pay attention? That question hit a sore place because it brushed against the shame I'd already been carrying. The shame of not asking, not checking, not insisting. For a moment, my eyes stung. I almost apologized, out of habit. But then I remembered the forged signature. I remembered the notebook line, "Don't let it reach Maggie." I remembered how Bob had made my ignorance part of his plan. I lifted my chin. "I paid attention to my life," I said, voice firm. "I raised my children. I worked. I ran our home. I trusted my husband when he told me we were safe. Trust isn't permission to forge my name." The room went quiet in that way that isn't dramatic, but is meaningful. Even the judge looked up a little more fully, eyes on my face. The lender's attorney tried again. "But you lived in the home. You benefited." I felt a heat rise in my chest, not wild anger, but something clean. "I benefited from the home I thought we had," I said, "not from a loan I didn't sign. If someone steals your identity and buys groceries, that doesn't make it your debt. It makes it their crime." Jennifer's hand rested lightly on my elbow when I sat back down. A small gesture, but it steadied me. After more legal back and forth that made my head swim, statutes, precedents, arguments about responsibility, the judge called a short recess. David and I stepped into the hallway. My legs felt like they'd carried me miles. "How'd I do?" I asked, and I hated how small the question sounded. David squeezed my hand. "You were strong," he said. "You were you." We went back in. Everyone sat. The judge looked down at the papers again, then up at the room. I will never forget the sound of his voice when he said, "Based on the evidence presented." My heart thudded once, hard. The court finds that Mrs. Sullivan did not authorize the signature on the loan documents. The lender has not met the burden to establish her informed consent or legal obligation for this debt. The obligation is unenforceable against Mrs. Sullivan. For a second, I didn't understand. My brain was too full. Then Jennifer turned and whispered, "You won." I didn't burst into tears. I didn't jump up. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired in my bones. The kind of tired you feel after you've held something heavy for too long and finally set it down, only to realize your arms are still trembling. Outside the courthouse, the winter light looked brighter than it had any right to. David exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for weeks. Jennifer shook my hand and told me what would happen next. Paperwork, formal filings, the slow winding down of legal processes. I nodded, listening, but part of me was still stuck on the judge's words. Unenforceable against Mrs. Sullivan. My house was mine again. Not because Bob had protected it, because I fought for it. That night, I went home and stood in my living room. I ran my hand along the back of the sofa. I touched the edge of the mantel. Ordinary objects, suddenly precious. I wasn't romantic about it. I simply felt grateful for something solid. Then my phone rang. Emily. I stared at her name on the screen, my heart tightening in a different way. We hadn't spoken in weeks. Her silence had been its own kind of punishment. I answered carefully. "Hello?" Her voice was smaller than I expected. "Mom," she said, and she sounded like a child again for just a moment. Are you sitting down?" I sat slowly, as if my body already understood what was coming. "Yes." There was a pause, then a shaky breath. "I went to the bank today," she said. "I wanted to prove you were wrong. I wanted to show myself that Dad couldn't have done what you said." My throat tightened. "Emily." "I didn't go to the bank," she corrected quickly, words tumbling out. "I checked my credit, because I was so angry and I thought, fine, I'll look and then I'll tell you you're imagining things." My hands went cold. "And?" I asked, though I already felt the answer in my bones. Emily's voice cracked. "There's a credit card in my name. I didn't open it. The balance is... It's big, Mom, and my score, it's dropped. And there are late payments." For a moment, the room spun. Not because I was surprised. After everything, part of me wasn't. But because this was the final line Bob had crossed. Not just me. Not just our house. Our daughter. Emily whispered, "I don't understand. Why would he do that to me?" I closed my eyes, and grief finally showed its face. Not grief for the man, but grief for the damage. The way one person's secret can rot through an entire family like water through wood. "I don't know why," I said softly, "but I know it's not your fault." There was a sob on the other end of the line, the sound of someone's denial breaking. "I'm sorry," Emily said. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I thought you were trying to ruin him." I swallowed hard. "I didn't want to ruin him," I said. "I wanted to survive." We sat in silence for a moment, breathing together through the phone. Then I said, "We're going to handle this, Emily, the same way we handled mine. Step by step." Her voice was raw. Will you help me?" "Yes," I said, and I meant it. "I will." After I hung up, I sat for a long time staring at the darkened window. Winning in court didn't bring peace the way people imagine. It brought clarity. It brought a kind of freedom. And it brought the final truth. This wasn't just my story anymore. It was our family's story. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel trapped inside it. The morning after Emily called, I woke up before my alarm and lay there listening to the house. It was still winter, the kind where the light outside looks pale and hesitant, and everything creaks as it warms. For years, mornings in this house began with Bob's footsteps, his throat clearing, the familiar rhythm of him moving through rooms as if he owned the air. Now the house belonged to me in a different way. Not because the deed said so, though it did, thanks to the court, but because I could finally hear my own thoughts in it. Emily came over that afternoon. When she walked through the front door, she looked tired in the way you look when your mind has been fighting reality all night. She held her purse tight against her side like a shield. I saw my daughter, the woman she'd become, and I saw the little girl she used to be too. The one who used to climb onto Bob's lap and call him her safe place. That's what made this betrayal so complicated. It wasn't clean. It wasn't simple. It was love tangled with harm. She didn't say much at first. She just stood in the entryway and looked around like she was seeing our home for the first time. Then she whispered, "I'm sorry." I didn't lecture her. I didn't say I told you so. I'd had enough of being the keeper of other people's guilt. I walked over and wrapped my arms around her. She stiffened for a second, then melted into me and started to cry. Not the neat kind of crying, but the kind that shakes your whole body, the kind you can't hide behind pride. "I wanted him to be good," she said through tears. "I needed him to be good." "I know," I told her, rubbing her back the way I did when she was small. "I needed that too." We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where David and I had spread out the documents, the same table where I'd made the promise to stop protecting the secret. I poured coffee. Emily didn't touch hers. She just stared at the mug like it might explain something. "Jennifer can help you," I said. "We'll dispute the account. We'll file the reports. It's a process, but it's doable." Emily nodded, wiping her cheeks. "I feel stupid." I shook my head. "No, you feel what you feel when someone you trusted betrays you. That's not stupidity. That's being human." She looked up. How did you not fall apart?" I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was such a sincere question. "I did fall apart," I said. "I just did it in pieces, quietly, in the car, in the shower, in the grocery store aisle when I saw his favorite cereal. But I also realized something. Falling apart doesn't mean you stop moving." Emily stared down at the table. "Do you hate him?" That question is a heavy one. People like to think pain has one clean emotion at the center: hate, anger, grief. But it doesn't. "I hate what he did," I said slowly. I hate that he used us. I hate that he made our lives smaller to protect his pride. But hate doesn't erase 38 years. It doesn't erase the man who held your hand when you had the flu, or who sat up all night when you were a teenager and came home late, or who fixed the porch railing so your kids wouldn't fall. Emily's eyes filled again. So what do we do with that? I took a breath. We tell the truth and we carry what's real. That's all we can do. A few weeks later, Emily and David came with me to a meeting at the library. It started because Ruth, the bookstore owner, had mentioned something almost offhandedly one day while we were unpacking a shipment of paperbacks. You know, she said, sliding books onto the shelf, I've met women who've gone through what you're going through. Different details, same shape. They think it's just them. They think they're the only one. I froze with a stack of novels in my hands. How many? Ruth shrugged. More than you'd think. That stuck with me. Because for the first time, I realized my story wasn't rare. It was just quiet. It lived behind closed doors and polite smiles and phrases like, he handles the money. So I asked Jennifer about it. She didn't give me numbers like she was reading from a brochure. She spoke carefully, like she wanted me to understand without sensationalizing. It's common enough that there are support resources for it, she said, but many people don't report it. They don't even name it. Especially older women. Older women, women like me, women who were taught that asking questions was making trouble. That's how the idea formed slowly. What if we made a place for women to talk? Not to gossip, not to destroy anyone, but to understand what happened to them and to learn how to protect themselves. Ruth offered the back room of the bookstore one evening a month. Jennifer agreed to come sometimes and explain the basics: credit reports, fraud alerts, how to recognize red flags. David helped set up chairs. Emily printed simple flyers, nothing dramatic, just financial safety support group, confidential, all ages welcome. The first meeting, I expected no one, but 5 women showed up. 5. One was in her 70s wearing a cardigan that looked like it had been mended a dozen times. One was in her 40s, recently divorced, eyes sharp and tired. One was a young mother who said her boyfriend controlled her bank app and kept the passwords. They sat in the folding chairs and looked at me like I had answers. I didn't, not perfect ones. So I did what I've done my whole life when I didn't know how to be brave. I told the truth. My name is Maggie, I said, hands clasped in my lap. I'm 64. My husband died, and then I found out he'd been using my identity for years. He left me with debt I didn't sign. I thought I was safe because I trusted him. The room stayed silent, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was the kind that says, yes. I know that feeling. Then the woman in her 70s spoke. Her voice was soft but steady. My husband is alive, she said, and I found out last month he took out a loan in my name. I didn't even know we had a second mortgage. The young mother started to cry. The divorced woman shook her head, muttering, "It's always the same." In that moment, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not just pain, but purpose. Not the grand, heroic kind, the practical kind. The kind that says, maybe what happened to me can keep someone else from being blindsided. Over time, the meetings grew. People came and sat and listened. Some spoke, some didn't. But they left with small, concrete things: a list of steps, a phone number, the courage to look at their own credit report, the permission to ask questions. And I learned something else. Older women have a particular kind of strength. It's not loud. It's not performative. It's the strength of someone who has endured, who has cooked meals through grief and folded laundry through heartbreak and kept showing up even when they felt invisible. That summer, about a year after Bob died, I went to a different bank, one he had never stepped into, one that did not know the rhythm of Tuesday at 2 p.m. I wore a simple blouse and I brought 2 forms of ID like they asked. I sat with a banker who smiled and offered me tea. My hands trembled as I filled out the paperwork, but I made myself write slowly, carefully. When it came time to sign, I paused. Not because I didn't know how, but because the act of signing my own name felt like reclaiming something Bob had tried to steal. After the account was opened, the banker asked, "Would you like to update your name on the account records? Some customers prefer to include a maiden name." My chest tightened. My maiden name. I hadn't used it in decades. It belonged to the girl I used to be. Margaret Sullivan, before marriage made me Mrs. Bob Sullivan in 1,000 small ways. Yes, I heard myself say, I would. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No music swelled, no one clapped. The banker simply typed it into the system. But I felt it, deep inside, a quiet restoration. When I left the bank, I sat in my car for a moment and watched people walking in and out, carrying checks, making deposits, living their ordinary lives. I wondered how many of them were like me, trusting, assuming, letting someone else handle it all. I wanted to knock on every window and say, please look, please ask, please don't confuse love with control. Instead, I drove home and went to the bookstore. Ruth was shelving new arrivals. Emily was there too, helping me set up chairs for the support group meeting that evening. David had dropped off donuts and coffee and was in the back adjusting a lamp that kept flickering. My family looked different than it used to. There was a crack in the picture we once framed so neatly, but there was also something honest now, something we could build on. Emily came up beside me and said quietly, "I still miss him." I nodded. "Me too." Then she added, "But I'm glad you didn't stay silent." I turned to look at my daughter, really look at her, and I saw a woman who had been forced to grow in a way she didn't want to. I saw a woman learning to hold two truths at once, love and harm. "I'm glad too," I said. That evening when the women arrived, I greeted them at the door and handed them simple pamphlets Jennifer had printed. I watched them sit. I watched them relax a little, shoulders dropping, faces softening when they realized they weren't alone. And I thought about Bob, about Tuesday at 2:01 p.m., about a ritual built on secrecy. For years, those Tuesdays were my symbol of safety. Now, they were my symbol of something else. A reminder that safety isn't a feeling you borrow from someone else. It's something you build with information, with honesty, with the courage to look. If you're watching this and any part of my story feels familiar, I want you to hear me clearly. You are not too old to learn. You are not too late to check. You are not making trouble by asking to see the numbers. A good relationship can survive transparency. A dishonest one can't. Thank you for spending your time with me and listening to this story. I wish you good health, peace of mind, and happiness with your family. And if this story meant something to you, if it helped you, even a little, please subscribe and stay with us. There are more stories to tell, and you don't have to face them alone.